Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a newcomer into the temple. Coming to us from Tabletop Mirror and the developers of Tabletop Mirror, the one and only Varun Singh. How you doing today, man?
Hi, thanks for welcoming me. I'm doing well.
I'm glad to hear it, and congratulations on how well the backer kit run for Tabletop Mirror has been doing. It's at 24.1 thousand at the time we're doing this, as opposed when you were asking for 2,500.
Yeah, no, it's been amazing to see the support from our community, and really, I'm just extremely grateful. I mean, they've heard it a million times, but I truly am so blown away by all the support for our platform and our project, and it's just going to go all right back into it. We're going to make something really amazing.
So, one of the traditions around here is going into the humble beginnings, in a sense. So with that in mind, I'd like you to walk me through your introduction to role-playing games and what made it stick.
Sure. I started world building well before I started any sort of tabletop gaming. I was always sort of like a more imaginative / creative person. I think like a lot of people, or maybe not a lot of people, I would sort of come up with these sort of scenarios and like verbally talk through it with friends, and then like, you know, we didn't have dice or anything, but we were in a way playing a tabletop game just without the dice, where I was the GM and they were players. And this world building, I always had all these different ideas that I was sort of pulling together and building on, and I built a world. And then I, like every world builder, I fell in love with it, and then like every world builder, I threw it away because I didn't like it. And then I built another one, and then I built another one. My third world is actually the one where I got into tabletop gaming. Really, in short, I had a friend who had shown me D&D 3.5. So not quite the 5e that everyone might have heard of, but 3.5 works a lot the same. And he sort of just showed me how to build a character, and then we played like a quick one-shot. And I fell in love with like the freedom, but also that opportunity for this like creative storytelling aspect of it. And from there, it was off to the races. That's how I got into tabletop gaming. From there, I went to Pathfinder. After Pathfinder, I built my own system, and that's what I run today, actually.
Mm-hmm. So, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, nothing. Go ahead.
I do appreciate. I'm glad to see I'm not the only one running their own setup. Was it a case where you just house ruled your way into making your own game through Pathfinder? You know, you were doing Pathfinder, and then one house rule led to another, and now you've got a whole system.
Kind of, yeah. No, that's exactly kind of what happened. It was like, I think there was a tipping point, right? So like at first it was like I didn't like how a particular spell worked, or I didn't like how a particular item worked, or I was just building new items for my homebrew world. Things like that. And then at some point I realized like there were just fundamental flaws with the game that I just didn't like. So I run high dark fantasy. And by high, I mean I want players to be able to actually use level 9 spells without having some sort of like chaos happen as a result. So I realized with 3.5 Pathfinder, all of those systems, they don't really design you to go that high. They have rules for it, but the system sort of falls apart. And if you try doing it, you'll see what I mean. It's sort of like every game becomes a game of who gets hit with the big spell first. And the marshals become almost irrelevant, minus some details that kind of matter but don't really matter in this.
They become irrelevant, and if you try and make them relevant, the casting characters start reeing.
Yeah, exactly. And so I overhauled like one system after another. I started by overhauling the armor system, which immediately like fixed a lot of the high level problems, basically making armor continue to scale, but also at the same time kept the power balance a little bit more even. So now in my system, martials are a lot more resilient and hard to hit with magic, but magic is very devastating when it does land. Things like that, and it just one piece after another got changed, and then before I knew it, you look at my system and you have, my god, I kind of understand what's going on here, but you have no idea what's happening if you were trying to read it from a perspective of 3.5 or Pathfinder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that certainly makes sense. Now, with that in mind, did you do a fair bit of system hopping over the years?
I did very little bit of system hopping, actually. I think that's like probably the weirdest thing for me as a designer of a system. I looked at systems for specific reasons. So if I ever opened a system to look at it, I was going in there with a specific question trying to be answered. Like, how do I rebalance armor? How do I write a more dynamic magic system? How do I give player versatility without taking away optimality? And that was sort of like the questions I went in. And so like, I never really played a whole lot of different systems over the years, but I would sort of read about the rules, understand how they work, look at the stats behind them. I was a big numbers guy. I crunched all the numbers trying to figure out how things worked and then just adapted it over to my system. Recently, I've been playing a lot of different kinds of systems, though, specifically to help me understand how these systems work more intimately so I can make them work in Tabletop Mirror, which we'll talk about.
Yeah. Now, that's a good segue to get into Tabletop Mirror itself. So, as I understand it, this is meant to be a virtual tabletop platform that emphasizes homebrew support. So, how did the idea of doing your own VTT come to be?
So it started 6 years ago. So I've been DMing for, I would say, about 8 years now, like off the top of my head. World building for 12 or more. And around 6 years ago, when I started really foraying into like homebrewing my own world and building my own items and spells and rewriting the armor system and so forth, that's when I was like, okay, my players kept having to ask me every time they needed any sort of clarification. Like if they're just looking at their character sheets and they were like, oh, what does this item do? They'd have to come ask me. And so I was like, okay, it would be nice if we had an online resource. So I built, I'm a software engineer, so I built a quick site that was just basically an encyclopedia of things I've homebrewed. And that was a start, but it was terrible. It wasn't even called Tabletop Mirror back then. It was called A Moth's Guide, which was a character from my world's guide. And so my players would use it. It was pretty good in some ways, pretty bad in others. So then at some point, I had free time and I decided to rewrite it. That was the second rewrite. So the first one was building it, second one was rewriting it. Same thing kind of happened where it was better. It fixed all the things that I aimed to fix the first time. It still wasn't great at a lot of things, but it was getting better, and the UI was a little bit better and a little bit cleaner. It wasn't as drab. And then I rewrote it again. This time, it was by request of a friend, another GM, who wished he could use it for Pathfinder when, but at that time, my system was close enough to Pathfinder that it wouldn't have been too hard to support both. And so I did that. And then he started homebrewing, and I started homebrewing. So now you have two divergent paths of people homebrewing. And I was like, okay, how can I support as many varieties of systems as possible? And when you look at it like that, and you sit down and you really think about it, a lot of RPG games have some of the same fundamental core, right? They have some sort of backbone that involves players do things. They roll some check or an equivalent of a check against some sort of difficulty, whether it's a roll under, roll over, or whether it's a dice pool where they're trying to roll a few dice and trying to hit a certain number of sixes. It all kind of boils down to a similar structure.
The Rome policy is what I've come to call this. All roads lead to Rome.
Yeah, exactly. And so I built the fourth iteration, the one that was officially called Tabletop Mirror, in 2020. That's when I really started building it. And from there, I designed everything to be completely flexible. So you didn't need a programmer. You didn't need someone to know what they were doing to be able to do something that was worth, like people looking at was worth being used as a platform for something. And when I built this system that could just, understand what you're putting into it, from items to spells to abilities to whatever, I was like, well, heck, I'm already building everything minus the VTT. Let me just build the VTT, and here we are. And then, of course, there's like a lot of frustration. Like along the way, there was a lot of frustration about how VTTs work outside of Tabletop Mirror. So I was solving those problems as well.
Yeah. So given that, I'd like to play a little bit of a lightning round. I'm going to list off some VTTs, and you can tell me if you had experimented with them, what sort of frustrations you had with them, how you want to address them in Tabletop Mirror, if it was something you'd only been familiar with in name, that kind of thing. Think of it as a really, really dorky Rorschach test.
Sure.
Just without me showing you ink blots and pretending I wear glasses. I don't. I actually ate all my carrots and everybody else's. But so I'll start with Fantasy Grounds.
Never tried it. It wasn't around when I was looking at it more seriously.
You might have been better off, especially considering the price tag.
Maybe.
I know some people swear by it, but I'm not having my players spend $30 just to play it.
Yeah, that sounds absurd. That goes into a problem.
$60 for a GM license and $30 for a player license. Plus, there's like 2 different versions on Steam. There's the OG one, and then there's the one that uses Unity. And somebody coming in is not going to know which one is the better option.
Yeah,
they do a bit of digging. But Foundry.
Too technical. You have to basically be a programmer just to make anything work in there.
I tried Foundry for the current setup that I have. The problem is different games were supported in different iterations of Foundry, so it's like I had to install it twice.
Yeah.
And that's not going to be a problem if somebody's playing like just D&D and Pathfinder, because those are always going to be supported. But I'm not that guy.
Absolutely.
I've been doing the actual play that I do in its current form for about a year now, and we haven't touched D&D once.
Yeah, and I think that's a common thing. I think most people who are playing systems that aren't D&D, they're not. First of all, they're not programmers. Second of all, like they didn't want to program a whole VTT just to make their things work. I mean, Foundry helps to make it a little bit easier, but it's still, at its core, it's programming. You have to be able to program or script or do some sort of automations or rely on a community that's willing to do it. And so if you're playing an obscure game, good luck.
Yeah. Shard Tabletop.
Shard Tabletop. I can't say I've heard of that one either, actually.
And that's another one where you might be better off, because that was specifically built around 5e, so no moss.
That's probably why I never heard of it then. Never played it.
Owlbear Rodeo.
I've heard a lot about Owlbear Rodeo, actually. I even tried this one. My biggest thing about Owlbear is, like, they have a lot of the basic stuff, but they, like a lot of other VTTs, don't have the homebrew support. They don't have an integration between rules and lore. They focus heavily on maps, in my opinion, which is great, but if you're running an open world like I do, then you don't always have the time to draw out carefully your maps every single time. Like, usually I just need some color coding, and that's really all I need, and Owlbear just isn't built for that.
That, and trying to upload maps, you tend to have cases where the VTT's grid and the grid on the actual image don't match.
Yeah, exactly.
You get very, very precise with pixels, well, people are playing games to game. They're not playing games to be a background graphic designer.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I certainly am not that, and I don't feel like breaking out Illustrator again, because I've done my time.
Yeah, I think there's already enough skills that writers of systems and homebrewers really need. Like, being a GM is hard enough. Why should I also now have to be a graphic designer?
Yeah. Have you ever seen the whole thing of somebody spinning plates while holding them up while Saber Dance plays in the background?
Yes, I have.
That's the best metaphor for GMing that there is.
Exactly.
And of course, last but certainly not least, there's the big one in the sphere, and that's Roll20.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is one that I've personally looked at. I looked at this very carefully. I never bought a subscription, I'll be honest, but I looked into it very deeply because they promised or seemed to promise the things that you would want as a D&D player. But here's the thing. They don't care if you homebrew. They just don't. Like, sure, they might have some support for if you do something that's very close to being a core creation. But if you want to add a spell that creates a dice pool, good luck. If you want to create a sanity mechanic for your character, good luck. They've done better in the recent years. I think they're trying to do better in this. That being said, they're just so far behind. Like, you can't add homebrew. You can't change the rules of the game. You need someone on their side to come support that. And if you build your own system, they don't want to support it. They're not going to support it unless you've become the next D&D or Pathfinder. Their game selection's extremely limited.
And I know that they have the tools out there to do it, and there's plenty of people on their forums that have made custom sheets. Mm-hmm. But in order to do that, you need programming knowledge of HTML, and just getting the basics from their wiki is going to be absolutely no help to you.
Yeah.
And good.
I was gonna say, well, if you just need, also the other thing is, like, if you just need a small alteration, right? Like, I know so many GMs who just have rules about how nat 20s work. If you want to change that functionality in like 5e, you're gonna have to make your own sheet. You have to do everything from scratch, and that, to me, that doesn't make sense. Like, why should you have to rewrite the entire game just because you don't want nat 20s to be auto successes, or you want nat 20s to be handled some other way, or something like that?
I can only imagine the nightmare that the dice programming for what we're currently running, which is SMG's Robotech game, was, because depending on a kind of ladder, it can determine what die is going to count as one success or two successes. Instead, much like how in, say, World of Darkness, getting a 10 in that counts as two successes on right. Each die. It's a similar principle to that. Now, given that, would it be correct of me to say that what you wanted was a VTT where people are able to homebrew without needing an extensive knowledge of coding?
Yes. And I'll actually go one step further. I'll say, on Tabletop Mirror, we literally don't let you code. Like, there's no way to code. Instead, we make everything a form that you fill out. And it's not like a form that I read. It's not a form for some person on my team to read. It's a form for the Tabletop Mirror to understand what you're doing. So if you want a sanity mechanic, it's going to ask you, what do you want this field to be called? You'll say sanity. It'll ask you, like, what's the maximum? Maybe you say 100. What's the minimum? You say 0. And you set it up in a very, like, straightforward way. It's as simple as filling out a form. That being said, there's a learning curve. I'll acknowledge there's a learning curve, but it's not the same learning curve for programming. Like, it's more of a learning curve of knowing how to fill out the form, right? Like, if it asks you what's the minimum value, you might be wondering, like, what's the minimum value? That's the learning curve.
And since you're also building this for world builders, since, well, that's how you got your start, is the world building end of things, would that be not far removed from, say, World Anvil? In terms
That's
of
absolutely correct.
Being done, although World Anvil still has this exact same problem.
Well, so here's my problem with World Anvil. I'll be very direct about it. When I looked at World Anvil, I thought maybe it could solve my problem. So the problem I had with world building was I used to use Google Docs because I didn't want to pay money, and I got to a point where my Google Doc for my world got so big that the app crashed. Consistently, not even just once. It was like every time I opened the tab, it would crash. And I have a pretty beefy computer, so I can only imagine like what other people might be experiencing if they have beefier worlds than I do. So I looked at World Anvil very seriously, and I said, you know what's crazy? You have to pay $7 a month as of yesterday, as the last time I checked at least, $7 a month just to have something that isn't publicly accessible. So if you're someone who said, maybe one day I'll publish this, but you're not ready to pull that trigger, well, you get to pay $7 a month until you decide to pull that trigger. It's, to me, that alone was a deal breaker. I was like, why? What do you mean I have to pay just for that? And not to mention, like, functionality-wise, they don't do all that much. Especially when I looked at it 6 years ago, they don't do all that much. They basically create a wiki, which we have on Tabletop Mirror. They now have chronologies and they have a few other fancier features, but a lot of it is a solvable problem without using World Anvil. Like a common popular solution people look at is Obsidian, right? Like Obsidian can do almost everything World Anvil can do, and it's much more reasonable. Like people pay for Obsidian for completely different reasons. It's like that you can try out Obsidian. You can't really try out World Anvil unless you're willing to have all your stuff be public. And that was my biggest problem with it.
I can certainly see that. There's some campaign settings I've been kicking about that I'd like to put up in something like World Anvil, but the combination of not making a very good first user experience for me and that whole $7 thing, like I'd want to experiment with it, not dive headfirst into it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that should be a thing that everyone should be allowed to do, is just try something before you buy it, right? Especially because in this world, you know, it's hard to even buy things outright anyway. So,
Yeah, that's I remember there was a video game store in my area called Juco Games back in the day that did do this thing of like 15-minute demos of any game that they had on shelf. Um, and granted, depending on the game, 15 minutes isn't going to be enough, but the effort was appreciated. Um, obviously you couldn't get a feel for like an RPG from the first 15 minutes, but the other thing is I had thought I'd be at one point I had thought I'd be able to use World Anvil to be the unified index that I try and do for my campaigns. Since something I try and do, given the myriad splat books and the like, is try and create a unified index so that people can look at different spells, different effects, different feats, and so on, instead of just what's in the core book. Sometimes what's in the core book isn't going to match what they want to do. And closest I've been able to do to that is Scrivener, and then convert that into Google Docs, which is workable, but I wouldn't call it elegant. And it sounds like with what you're doing, there's ways to do rule spin-offs.
yes. So I think the way I'm sort of solving all these critiques I have of these like previous platforms you just mentioned is I'm creating a unified platform that you can do everything from your homebrew to your rule building. That's what we've already talked about. The doors this opens is the stuff that's really exciting to me. Like I run my sessions, at least the non VTT part of it. I run my world building, I run all my rules management, my home brewing, all of it runs through Tabletop Mirror as of right now. I run it every week, twice a week. And it's so seamless to be able to look at my lore, look at a quest, and be like, oh, this item, at the end of the quest, the players receive the Trinity Blade. I'm like, okay, what's the Trinity Blade? And I click on it, and it takes me to the stat block for the Trinity Blade. And then the Trinity Blade has this big lore entry on the page in addition to its stat block, and it says, okay, like, it refers to the event of, you know, X country 500 years ago, and I can click on that. It takes me to the timeline where it shows where that happened. That is this powerful interaction that I just can't imagine not being without. It's, if I was on Foundry, if I was on Roll20, if I was on World Anvil, any of these, I might be able to have one of these pages or a couple of these pages. Like maybe I have my timeline, maybe I have my quest page. But if I want the stat block, well, now I have to open a separate tab or a separate window entirely just to go find the stat block. It's this complete separation of lore and rules that just doesn't make sense to me. And that's something I'm trying to address, is like first and foremost, like I want to be able to go back and forth very easily. And so that's something I'm doing right from the get-go.
Yeah.
And that alone is like a game changer to me.
Now,
not to mention everything else.
I know on the page it talks about using InDesign style tools to format homebrews. Would somebody need to have foreknowledge of how InDesign works in order to properly utilize it, or is that not the case?
No. It's what I mean by InDesign tools is like you lay out a page. So if you want to print out your homebrew, this is mostly for printing and publishing. So if you want to print and publish your homebrew, you define the structure of the page. Like, where does text go? Where do images go? Where does this go? Where does that go? And then once you have that layout specified, let's say you want to print your entire homebrew book, then you go to your book and you say, I want to export this as a PDF, and it asks you for what's your layout. You just select the layout you created, and then it'll automatically insert text, insert images. It'll create your book for you.
Mm-hmm.
So it creates this ability that you can have a very dynamic, very like web-based experience for when you want to be on a computer looking at things, but then you can easily just 2 or 3 click export it to a PDF and make it as presentable as like the 5e core rulebook.
It sounds like what you're doing with that is a much more user-friendly version of what's done with, say, Homebrewery.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I looked at Homebrewery as well. It's like Homebrewery is great if you have a very specific style you want to go for, and even then it's a little finicky. But I say, like, I give you full control. You want to make your entirely new design? That's fine. You want a black book with gold ink? Fine, then make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
All I do is provide the tools for people to do what they want to do.
Yeah, the blue
and that's
bucket of Legos.
Exactly. Yes, we're just the toolbox. What the users do with it is up to them, and that's always been my philosophy.
Yeah. Now, there's a few things I wanted to ask in terms of putting this kind of thing into practice, because even when it comes to just die rolling or its equivalent, there are some things that a good amount of VTTs don't seem to quite know how to handle, or at least handle with any elegance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the big ones is non-dice resolution. And the big example of this is going to be ones that utilize cards. A couple big examples of this would be the 2 games that came out of the Saga engine back in the 90s, Dragonlance 5th Age and the Marvel Adventure game. Other examples would be Faith from Burning Games, Faith the sci-fi RPG, which I've covered on this channel in the past, as well as all of the games in the Saga Machine family by Tab Creations. So stuff like Dime Adventures, Age of Ambition, Shadows over Soul, Against the Dark Yogi. Each of these is using cards. Several of them are using a standard playing card deck as the resolution mechanic instead of dice. And while there's the card options with it and holding a hand within, say, Roll20, it is still kind of awkward. So I'm curious how Tabletop Mirror would handle something like that.
Yeah, so I'll be very upfront first. We're still in our beta. We're still building out features, but we hit our card goal recently. So let me tell you what the plan is. Right now, we have a whole rule system management page. This is where you define what is your rule system. What makes your rule system different from other rule systems? You know, you say that I have the strength score, or I have a sanity score, or I have a whatever score you want to add in. And you define all that on this page. On this page, there will now be a way, in addition to being able to say what is the dice resolution mechanic, you can also specify a card resolution mechanic. And that will look like basically defining what your deck of cards look like. So maybe it's a standard playing card deck. Maybe it's a tarot deck. Maybe it's some other offshoot of a tarot deck. Or maybe it's something entirely on your own. Regardless of what it is, you can define it either way. And you will also be able to specify who draws from this deck and what are the sort of different piles and the flow of cards between these different decks. So you might say, I have a main deck, I have a hand, I have a graveyard, I have a exile, for example. And you could specify which of these are viewable by the user at any given time versus which of them are going to be hidden. And then once you've defined it in the rule system, when you enter that VTT, it'll read what you've specified. Again, you sort of filled out a form, and it'll read that form, and it'll show you what you're allowed to see, hide what you're not allowed to see, and it'll handle all the transition of cards as they move around. In my opinion, the goal should be that if you wanted to, you could use Tabletop Mirror to play Magic the Gathering. That's the sort of level of control I'm giving my users. We still have a long way to go between here and there, but that's the end goal. Yeah. And I'm a Magic player, so I know what needs to be done to get there, and so we'll be defining it with those parameters in mind.
I hope to God you didn't play sliver decks.
I did not. No, I did not. But I thought they were funny.
I think, no, they're funny until you're playing against one, and then they're not funny, they're rage-inducing.
Absolutely.
Or that god awful rainbow deck that would Zerg rush everybody within
Absolutely.
my group during the Mirrodin days. Oh.
Hmm.
Then again, during the Kamigawa era, I played a very ninja based deck. Where somebody thinks I'm wide open, and then I realize, nope, I'm not wide open, and now you're getting hit with five ninjas.
Hmm.
Uh, but the next thing is, plenty of games will have some sort of time-based debuff. Take a -2 penalty for this for 1d4 rounds or something like that. And those have always been tricky to track. Um, and I'm not asking if this is something in there now, but do you have plans on creating means so that during play those could be tracked and automatically counted down during the turns?
Yes. So that's our benefit of having an integrated calendar system. So, to my knowledge, very few platforms even have an integrated calendar system. But I say on Tabletop Mirror, you can define a fantasy calendar. Maybe you have a year of 200 days and like 10 months or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's fine. We can handle that. When you're running a game as a DM, the tools that are available to you will include a time tracker that uses a calendar that you define. So it could either be a calendar that's like publicly available, like maybe it's the official calendar for the Forgotten Realms, hypothetically, assuming we had the rights for that and all that.
I was thinking more the calendar with Exalted, because that's a very different
Sure.
affair.
Yeah, sure. Any calendar you want, or maybe you have just like the Pluto calendar, like the IRL Pluto calendar. That's fine. When you as a DM are running session, you can track time using that calendar system. So you can say you can change that time whatever you want. You could be like, oh, an hour passed, 2 hours passed, 3 hours passed, whatever. When that happens, there is a way that when you're defining the calendar, it connects to the rule definitions calendar pacing. So you could be like, oh, I'm using Pluto's calendar, so the year is a lot longer, but 1 second here is still 1 second in the rules. And so we can make that connection. So when you say an hour passes on Pluto, maybe the time and day changes a little bit differently than you'd expect, but an hour still passed. So spells that should have went off or should have only lasted an hour will now start going off. And this sort of automation is something we're definitely working on. It's already something we're aiming from when we first designed our calendar systems.
Yeah, I can certainly get that. And could that be done at the micro level, i.e., individual rounds?
Yeah, it could be as specified as you want. We even leave it to the DMs and the rule set designers to define the granularity of time passage. If you want things to happen on microsecond pacing, that's fine. That's totally cool. If you want to use real time passage, like IRL, how long time passes, then we can support that as well.
Mm-hmm. So continuing on from that, this is where I have to bring up something I've been working on. Because I've mentioned this elsewhere on the channel, but for the last 3 years, I've been doing a fan project called Final Fantasy TRPG Legend Edition, which I'm hoping to have out into the public by the end of the year. We're getting close to its completion, and this particular game is going to have some unorthodox approaches to certain parts of the die roll. It is D20 based, but we're also integrating some aspects of the Boon and Bane setup from Shadow of the Demon Lord, which, when you're doing the D20, is rolling a set of D6s and taking either the highest or lowest of those D6s, depending on how many boons or banes you end up getting, and of course they cancel each other out. That's one thing. The other thing is something we have called the extra effort rule, and this is the one mechanic that I wanted to see how Tabletop Mirror might be able to handle this, because it's not exactly a standard pass fail kind of thing. The way that it works is, when you're making an attack, it's roll high. You're trying to get past their defense number, so standard fare there.
Mm-hmm.
For every few points over that defense number that you get, when you roll damage for that attack, you can generate what's known as extra effort dice. And these are always, with rare exception, D4s. So, if, for example, a longsword, for instance, might be classified as a medium melee weapon, that would generate 1 every 4 points over defense that you end up rolling. So
Sure.
I'm curious if this is something that Tabletop Mirror could handle.
Yeah, so let's talk about where we are right now and where we'll be by the end of the year. Where we are right now is we support 90% of everything you just said. So from rolling the d20 and checking if it's a successful hit to rolling even the extra effort die, those are all things we can do. The way it would look like today, like right now as I'm talking, if you went on and you had this all put into the system, then you could have a player roll their attack roll, or they're trying to penetrate the defense, and the DM, when they're requesting the roll, they can either they actually, in tomorrow's update, I should say, we do a weekly update. Tomorrow's update includes the ability for the DM to say your DC is this, and once the DM sets that, that'll tell you whether the attack succeeded or failed. That's fine. It'll always still show both the actual result and the result that was aimed for, like the DC, so to speak. If that's the case, you will, as a player and as a GM, be able to see what was the actual result of the roll and then what was the intended aim. From there, you'd have to manually then be like, all right, we exceeded by this amount, my weapon is this, and therefore I need to roll this many extra effort dice. And then they would have to roll that separately. So that's where we are today. We can handle all that, and that'd be fine, and there would be no issues on that.
Yeah.
The part we want to get to, and I'm going to tell you about a feature that is definitely going to happen this year. It's on the roadmap. It's like probably one of my most requested features. We're building something called macros. And the way we're approaching it is probably like how you've probably imagined macros from other VDTs. The difference is we're going to approach it more like a recipe book. So you're going to tell the system, step 1, roll a d20 and compare it against the DC the DM provides. Step 2, take the result, subtract it from the DC the DM provided, and then look up a specific stat of the weapon that was used. And then from that, ask for another roll of d4s based on this. It'll be very step by step. It's very straightforward, and it's all going to be based on not programming. You're just going to define it as the weapon has a size category or whatever. I forgot what stat you mentioned it is, but it'll basically look up that stat on the fly and do that calculation for you.
Mm-hmm.
So by the end of the year, we'll be able to automate that entire process. No problem.
Yeah. And that is an important thing to note, because if I tried to do this system in, say, Roll20, I would have to do all the programming for it myself. Because what the extra effort thing, all it really is a degrees of success thing, like how in, say, any of the 40k D100 RPGs, there's an extra degree of success for every 10 points. It's been a few years since I touched Dark Heresy, so take that with a grain of salt. And I still haven't read through Imperium Maledictum. All this is just giving a extra die roll to that effect instead of just saying you succeed more.
Yeah.
To that end, when it comes to games that use more customized dice, like, say, Legend of the Five Rings 5th edition, or Genesis, or the FFG Star Wars trilogy, or even fudge dice used in fudge games and Fate games, would those be things you guys are planning on tackling?
So yes, custom dice is actually slated for this month. We have someone actively working on, not on my team officially, but sort of a member of our community, working on the Star Wars RPG, as you mentioned, which has their variants of dice and a very complicated dice system overall. We're going to support fully customized dice. So what does that mean? That means you can build a dice, or we'll be able to build a dice later this month, where you say, this is how many sides it has. And mind you, we don't constrain ourselves to physical dice. You could literally have a D7 if you wanted to. You'd say there's this many sides to the dice. This is what's on each side. And then the simple cases, maybe you have a maybe you have a D6 where there's 2 1s instead of a 6. Or maybe you have something more complicated, like how Star Wars has their success, like failure resolution system. Whatever it is, we'll support that. And then when you're specifying what dice is rolled, you would just say it doesn't use the D4 or normal D4, it uses my special custom D4 or my custom D6 or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
So by the end of this month, we'll support all of this.
Yeah, that's good. That's certainly going to be good to hear on that front. The other thing, and this was something I was complaining about constantly when I did my campaign of Sword World 2.5, which I just wrapped up about a month ago, was whenever a new token was put on there, I had to go through all of the default values so that stuff like HP and MP and the like was shown on each one manually, and then go in so that it's checked off to be shown to players. When it comes to tokens for Tabletop Mirror, do you have plans on setting up like defaults for individual monsters and the like?
So no, we won't set up defaults because we want to leave control in your hands. What we will have is what's called an asset library. This was our first stretch goal, and we actually have another version of the stretch goal at our 12.5 thousand mark, and we hit that as well. So what the asset library will do is it will provide a library of assets that basically we will buy for everyone to be able to use. And then anyone can use that for anything they want to do. If they create a stat block for a specific monster, they can specify the default is, X monster, or they can upload their own. And this sort of flexibility is something I always keep very core to TTM, is I don't want to impose a limitation. I want to instead give you a door to open and use as you want to use it. And creating this asset library is sort of how I'm doing that, right? So maybe you have a snake stat block, and maybe the snake stat block uses like the generic snake picture from our asset library. Or maybe you have your own snake like picture that you want to use instead. The point is it's your choice.
Yeah. Now, with that in mind, with you guys at the time we're covering this, you guys have about 19 days to go. When do you plan on rolling out the test version for backers, and when do you plan on rolling out the test version for public? Obviously, a hard date is going to be a bit of an ask, so I'm asking for like a ballpark.
Our open beta is open right now for everyone, and you could log on right now, make an account, doesn't cost you anything, and just see if you like it. I mean, there's a bit of a learning curve, so it might take you a while, but there's no time limit. Like, you can be on it as much as you want. Even after we aim for our 1.0 launch and we start, having more restricted tiers, like our main approach on pricing will be tier-based. We can talk about that if you'd like to, but there will always be a free tier. And I expect 90% of people, no, I would say 99% of people are probably going to be in that free tier. If you're a player, I would be shocked if you need a membership. If you are even a DM who is doing pretty by-the-book gameplay, you're not going to need a membership. You only will need a membership if you're a big creator. If you're creating a lot of things, if you're building an entire world or building your own system, you might need our lowest tier, which is $20 a month. Or $20 a year, sorry. $20 a year, not $20 a month. It's $3 a month. But the point is, like, it's going to roll out the 1.0 version, which will have, all the features I'm talking about. There will never be feature paywalling. Anyone can use any feature they want. It's all just based on your storage space. Our 1.0 is when we'll sort of shift into like, okay, there's like a limitation of like how much you can create before you need a membership. And that will be probably around early 2025, I would say. We're aiming hopefully around January or February. But if we have to push it back to get some key features out, so be it.
Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, when it comes, I think one of the other things is you said that you wanted this to be able to be played with that somebody could play Magic the Gathering with your system. That was one of the goals that you mentioned when we talked about cards.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
if somebody wanted to do a full-on war game, a la War Machine or Infinity, um, with the tools that you have, would somebody be able to do that? Or even if they wanted to make their own war game um, on Tabletop Mirror?
We've been starting to actually hear about people trying to use Tabletop Mirror for war games.
Mhm.
And I don't think they've had any substantial issue, as in, like, if the rules are conformable to the general structure of an RPG, which is a pretty broad category, then there's no issue. It's not like you have to do a dice roll. You don't even have to use card resolutions. A system that maybe not a lot of people hear about is Nobilis. Nobilis is a system where you're a god and you can do whatever you want, just using up resource points instead. We almost support it. We support 95% of its functionality today, and we're going to finish automating it by the end of the year for sure.
I'm certainly familiar with Nobilis.
Yeah. So if you can do that, then I can't imagine why a war game would be anything particularly challenging.
Yeah, and when it comes to army management, I don't think that'd be too much of an issue. Plus, there's plenty of applications already that are built for that exact thing. Oh, main reason I ask is because one of the war games that I've been keeping a very close eye on and did an interview with the developers of on this channel is War Surge, which is intended to be a setting agnostic war game.
I'm not familiar with it specifically, but even on just on what I can say we could do right now is, like, you could go on right now and redefine all of the navigation menus. So instead of spells, maybe you have like world casting, or instead of characters, you have armies. Instead of stat blocks or NPCs, you have factions or whatever have you, and you can define what defines an army, what defines like a world casting, what defines all these things, and it's entirely up to you. So like the resource management, I'm not even worried about that. Like, I'm sure we could do that too.
All right, I can certainly get that. But with that said, I'm certainly going to be looking forward to seeing how it develops. And I do want to give my thanks to you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my temple for both my questions and my particular brand of crazy. And anytime you see fit to return, whether it's to further discuss this or talk about how the dice gods are true believers in equality by hating everyone, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged.
Yes, and thank you for having me. It was nice to talk about all of these things and more.
Yeah, and of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there will be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.